Hello, I'm Michael McCabe, the CEO of Intelligence Fusion, and I'm joined today on this webinar by our Senior Regional Analyst for the Middle East and South Asia, Max Taylor. Today we're going to talk about how real is Israel's threat to strike Iran. After the webinar, we'll be answering questions in our brand new intelligence community over on Discord. Our growing community offers security intelligence professionals as well as OSINT enthusiasts a place to share their thoughts and findings, as well as contribute to the group discussions and tap into the expertise of our analyst team. We've created a dedicated channel for listeners of this webinar to continue the discussion, connect with each other, and get further insight from us. To join, click the link in the most recent email from the team and find more details in the webinar description. So moving on to the first part of the webinar, Max, I guess the question that frames everything we're going to talk about today is, what is the issue?
Yeah, so I think it's important that we provide a little bit of context. So Israel and Iran have been very much adversaries to each other since the Iranian Revolution back in the 70s. And more recently, in around 2010, there's been quite crippling sanctions were placed on Iran in response to their attempts to try and develop their nuclear infrastructure. And since then, more recently still, Iran and Israel have been carrying out what can be described as a proxy war between the two of them, rather than a direct conventional conflict. And this has come in the forms of militant groups attacking Israel with rocket attacks, as well as Israel targeting Iran proxy forces in countries such as Syria and even Iraq at times too. And we've also seen this manifest itself in the form of attacks against shipping. So we saw quite recently actually a drone strike targeting a ship off the coast of Oman, and this was believed to have been carried out by an Iranian drone targeting a vessel affiliated with an Israeli businessman. So it's quite a complicated conflict, and whilst they're not openly in a state of war, it's not like there's tanks driving across each other's countries or anything like that. It's more in the threshold between war and peace at the moment, in this grey area where neither side's openly declaring war on each other, but both sides are perfectly happy to use military assets to attack each other.
So the nuclear deal seems to be quite key with everything that's happening at the moment in sort of recent years. So what's the key overview of the nuclear deal and why and what's happening with it at the moment?
So the nuclear deal is essentially a deal between Western countries in particular. So Europe tends to come together on this, and America and Iran, to try and control and restrain Iran's nuclear ambitions somewhat. And in response, Iran would have got sanctions relief, which would have helped its economy, which is struggling at the moment. And these sanctions are part of the reason for that as well. So this would have, in theory, this was a win-win situation for the two of them.
And I guess there's a bit of a transition between the Trump and Biden administrations in relation to the deal in Iran. So, back in May 2018, when it was US President Donald Trump, he abandoned the deal, he reinstated US sanctions, and he wanted a new deal that would help to curb Iran's ballistic missile program and its involvement in regional conflicts. Now, Iran refused and saw the value of its currency plummet, and its inflation rate soar as sanctions really took effect. Now, when the sanctions were tightened in May 2019, Iran began to reduce its commitment to limit uranium enrichment. And I think recently at the UN General Assembly, the new Prime Minister for Iran, Naftali Bennett, he stated that Israel doesn't have the privilege, we will not tie it. Israel will not allow Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon, and Iran has enriched uranium to the level of 60%, which is one step short of weapons grade material, and they're getting away with it. So from an Israeli perspective, they appear to be very, very conscious as to just how close Iran is getting to a nuclear weapon. So we've talked about President Trump. How is it President Biden with regards to this issue, and what's his framing of it from a US perspective?
Yeah, I'd say, I don't know if you'd agree with this, to be honest, it's not my sort of area of expertise, but I'd say Biden is much more of a domestic politics sort of guy. So I think when it comes to his foreign policy, he's much less willing to use US force to try and resolve any issues. So I think with that in mind, he's approaching the Iran nuclear deal much more open-minded than the Trump administration was, I guess. So he's trying to re-engage with it, and the Israelis actually do seem willing to go along with this. They do seem willing to allow this nuclear deal to go ahead, even though it will sort of legitimize Iran's nuclear project in some respect. The Israelis do see this as a way of actually preventing Iran from gaining nuclear weapons. But at the same time, Israel's made it pretty clear that they want to have a plan B, and they've also made it abundantly obvious that they intend to use military force if they're pushed to that point. And what it would take to push them to that point, not 100% clear yet. But it's interesting, kind of what I was saying earlier, actually, about in theory, both sides will gain from a nuclear deal. I think in theory is quite key there. So as you mentioned, as the administrations change, attitudes towards this deal change with it. So what might seem completely logical to one administration, another administration, whether it be in the US or even in Iran, may have completely different logic to what they actually want from this deal. So internal pressures, social pressures, economic pressures may completely influence how they approach this deal. So at the moment, yes, we're seeing Biden becoming more open-minded to a deal with Iran, but Israel is very, very aware of the fact that they're very vulnerable to a change in administration and a much more hawkish US administration reversing this process.
And that's exactly the word I was going to use in relation to Trump. He was a lot more hawkish in relation to Iran. And obviously with Israel, he decided to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which caused massive issues. And then with him withdrawing the US from the nuclear deal, that's obviously escalated this crisis. Now, from Biden's perspective, he's withdrew the US from Afghanistan. I really can't see him at the moment wanting to get into another conflict within the Middle East over this issue in relation to Iran and their nuclear program. But also, and I guess it comes back to looking at the sort of the global nuclear warhead inventories around the world. The point here from an Iranian perspective is that Israel has 90 warheads, whereas Iran has none. And I think the question is, do people want to see a nuclear Iran, especially when Iran has been supporting terrorism globally for many decades now?
Yeah, and Israel is very aware that a change in the balance of power would essentially level the playing field, but that would mean that Israel, who currently have a massive advantage, would lose out and Iran would gain. So this is something that, from a purely sort of power projection point of view, Israel is going to be quite reluctant to see the status quo change. But yeah, I think a lot of states, even if they're somewhat tolerant, not necessarily allies with Iran, but at least siding with them in their sort of confrontation with the Western world in general, I think even they may be somewhat distrusting of Iran and their intentions with nuclear weapons, because at the moment, a lot of these relationships Iran has with countries such as Russia are more based on the situation rather than they are on genuine ideological core reasoning for a relationship. So it's so I think, yeah, as you said, they do distrust Iran somewhat, and also there's going to be concerns over whether Iran will be selling it, not necessarily nuclear weapons, but parts to other states that are trying to acquire nuclear warheads. So I can't see Iran selling a nuclear weapon at any time in the future if they were to get one, but it's not impossible. It's not out of the realms of possibility to see a state such as Iran selling parts of their, or at least information or knowledge to other countries or even groups.
I guess it's the North Korea situation. It's you have this weapon of mass destruction, and therefore you're essentially untouchable at that point. Yes, it has a lot of implications to it, but from an Iranian perspective, and I think this is why we've seen them so muted recently in relation to things like the Qasem Soleimani assassination. Soleimani was assassinated at Baghdad airport using a drone, and the Iranians responded by firing ballistic missiles at Al-Assad Air Base, but it was at a very specific place at Al-Assad Air Base where there were no casualties going to be caused. And that seemed to be very specific. And we've been seeing for years now that, in part, the reason why they're so muted is because if they are very hostile in their response, then there could be a strike against their nuclear weapons program, and it prevent them from actually getting a nuclear weapon. Because once they get that nuclear weapon, it completely changes the dynamic. And then Iran, with that weapon of mass destruction as their sort of backup, could be a lot more aggressive within the region. And they're already, we've seen through the Shia Crescent, they're significantly pushing their influence across the region. And this is at a time when we've seen the Iraq conflict, and we've seen US influence wane significantly because of the Iraq conflict, and actually Iranian influence significantly increase through the Iraq conflict. So it just seems that once they've got a nuclear weapon, it just gives them even more influence within the region. And I guess part of the issue then is, would Saudi allow Iran to just sit there as a nuclear state and them not as a nuclear state? And could this actually get us to a point where there are many other Middle Eastern nations who then seek to be nuclear powers?
Exactly, yeah. I think, sort of as you were touching on there as well, Iran is very realistic about what its capabilities are right now without the nuclear weapon, and it's very aware of how vulnerable it is to a conventional military response from whether it be USA, Israel, or any even just regional states, because the Iranian military is somewhat dated. I do think the Iranian government is often kind of characterized as this irrational actor that can't be trusted by any means, but I think I think the Iranian government's much more realistic than it's often given credit for, particularly in sort of our own media and this side of this part of the world. So I think it's I think you're right to say that they are biding their time, I guess, waiting until they've got a bit more leverage, and then perhaps we'll see a change in tone.
So one thing we have to talk about is the Begin Doctrine. So the Begin Doctrine is the common term for the Israeli government's preventative strike counter-proliferation policy, and that's in relation to their potential enemies' capabilities to possess weapons of mass destruction, and in particular nuclear weapons. Now the doctrine itself was announced by Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin in June of 1981, following Israel's attack on the Iraq's nuclear reactor in Iraq in Operation Opera. The Begin Doctrine was followed in 2007 under Prime Minister Ehud Olmert.
Menachem.
I know, it's the words.
Yeah, good luck with those.
The Begin Doctrine was followed in 2007 under Prime Minister Ehud Olmert. How do you say
I actually don't know. I think
Ehud Olmert?
Right, yeah.
So the Begin Doctrine was followed in 2007 with Operation Outside the Box against a Syrian nuclear facility. And then the doctrine has been used since 2009 under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu with regard to Iran and its nuclear capability. Now, Netanyahu has repeatedly referred to a nuclear Iran, or even a nuclear-capable Iran, as an unacceptable and existential threat to Israel. And with virtually all Israelis agreeing that Iran should be prevented from acquiring nuclear weapons, there's an ongoing bitter debate amongst policymakers on how best to achieve this goal. And whilst the US and Europe implement economic sanctions and pursue diplomatic solutions, the Israeli government carries out covert operations such as computer viruses like the Stuxnet incident, as well as assassinations of key Iranian scientists designed to stall Iran's nuclear program. Now, the difference between these incidents and a strike against Iran is that these previous incidents were strikes against single sites. Now, if Israel was to target Iran's nuclear program, they would have to be targeting several facilities that are spread across Iran, and they range from being surface to subsurface locations, which just makes a targeting of Iran much, much more complex. So with regards to what we've been seeing since 2009, how is this current conflict playing out between the two sides in the region?
So sort of, as we touched on earlier, neither side is really willing to directly strike the other with its own conventional forces against the other conventional forces. There's always an element of plausible deniability to all of these, to any action taken between the two states. And what I mean by plausible deniability is you can basically, people will be 99% sure that either Iran or Israel carried out this attack. However, that last 1% is what's needed to fully confirm it, to be able to act upon it with any sort of military response. So it's often very clear that Iran, for example, may have used a drone strike to target a vessel off the coast of Oman, but at the same time, without 100% proof, it's hard to actually respond to that with a military response. So with this in mind, I sort of describe how it's playing out. I'll start with Israel and what they've been doing, and then I'll explain Iran in a second. So Israel generally is very concerned with what's going on closer to its borders, as Iran has extended its influence into countries such as Syria and Lebanon. So we've seen Israeli aircraft carrying out multiple airstrikes targeting mostly Iran-backed militias in Syria, and as well as a few in Iraq, but they're almost the vast majority of these have been in Syria, close to the Israeli border. And these strikes have generally targeted not only the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, but also militias affiliated with the IRGC. So it's that's a common tactic, and it's not necessarily the most sophisticated, but it's common, and it does seem to be effective in at least suppressing, I think, the influence of Iranian militias. It's not necessarily removing them, though. We've also seen Israel stepping up from this. So these attacks in Syria are relatively low in terms of scale of significance, I think, in this conflict between the two sides, because it's unlikely that Iran will respond to them. This isn't taking place in Iranian soil, it's not taking place in Israeli soil, and it's an indirect attack of militias affiliated with Iran rather than Iranian forces in Iran itself. But more recently still, we've seen Israel perhaps upping the ante a bit with the assassination of a nuclear scientist just outside of Tehran. And this assassination was an incredibly bold move, actually, and it was, I think, it almost didn't really come out of nowhere, but it was unexpected, I think, just because of the boldness of it. And it's not entirely confirmed even to this day exactly what was used to carry out the assassination, but it was generally believed to have been done using a remote-controlled automatic weapon set up on the side of a road, which ambushed a vehicle of a nuclear scientist as he drove past. And this was actually, interestingly, this was displayed in Iranian media immediately after reporting too, who talked about robots carrying out this attack, and obviously with translation issues and reliability of Iranian state media in general, a lot of this talk of robots carrying out an assassination was kind of dismissed, and it was a pretty suspect report, but it did soon pan out that this was actually partly the case, albeit loosely. So Iran, on the other side, rather than carrying out airstrikes targeting Israeli militias, which there aren't really many of, if any, Iran's taken a more subtle route in some respects, in that Iran's attempted to expand its influence throughout the Middle East via a form of militias organized by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps. And this in itself isn't necessarily the most threatening feature to Israel, but then what we've seen is these militias getting closer and closer to Israel's border, to the point where they're now essentially on Israel's border. So you've got the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, who are an umbrella term for a series of militias, but a lot of them fall heavily under Iranian influence, as well as groups like Hezbollah, Fatah Ma'un militias in Syria, and others who operate alongside IRGC advisors, as they're often called. And then in Iran, in Lebanon, you've got significant Hezbollah presence, not only militarily but also in Lebanese politics. So they have a huge amount of influence there. And then lastly, in Palestine itself, so you've got Hamas and the PIJ and other groups based in Gaza, who frequently carry out mass rocket attacks targeting Israeli towns. And these rockets they're not ballistic missiles, they're not major rockets, but they cause, especially when they fire them in large numbers, a significant problem. So Iran's sort of response to these Israeli airstrikes is more based on proxy forces and using hard military power. It's more based on militias that they've got influence with and that they continue to arm.
I guess there's a point here of conflict in the region generally seems to end up with Iran just gaining more influence. I'd seen pictures from recent years of Qasem Soleimani stood on the border of Iraq and Syria in places like Anbar province, which just seemed incredible to me, considering Anbar is a completely Sunni province. Historically, you had Al-Qaeda, then you had Islamic State, who've controlled cities like Ramadi and Fallujah. And for Iran to have such control and influence across the region, for Shia militia groups to just be standing there on the border, seems incredible. Do you think that Iran is very much on the ascent in the region, and what sort of impact do you think that is having on Israel at the moment?
It's a hard question to answer, because I think it depends exactly what country you're looking in. But I think if I had to answer, one way or the other, I'd probably say yes, they are on the ascent, because ultimately a lot of the adversaries to Iran in the region are not from the region itself. So USA, for example, being the biggest threat to Iran, I guess, from an Iranian perspective, they're not going to stay there forever. US forces in the Middle East will ebb and flow in terms of numbers, but generally speaking, depending on the administration in question, they're going to be reluctant to have massive deployments of US forces in combat zones or even in non-combat zones for prolonged period of times, particularly after Afghanistan. So as a result, Iran can kind of play the long game a bit and wait out a lot of these US deployments. And because whilst Iran is foreign to a lot of the countries it's operating in as well, it's much less of a logistical issue and much less of a political issue as well. So yes, Iran has, I'd say, gained influence via these mostly Shia militias, and this, I think Iran's willingness to actually act with them as well is very important. So we've seen countries such as the US and other countries too, when they back a militia, there's often conditions. There's often, yes, but you can't use these weapons against so-and-so, or yes, but you can't operate here. Whereas Iranian forces are much more willing to give their proxies a freer rein. And also they're willing to supply them with more weapons. And you can see this for the Houthi rebels in Yemen. The amount of ballistic missiles that they own and the amount of drones that they possess is impressive. And this is heavily reliant on Iranian stocks. So Iran's willingness to supply these groups and willingness to allow them to use it and let them loose, I think, is a significant factor in why Iran is on the ascent.
So, and this is all happening without Iran having nuclear weapons. So I guess the question is, or the point is, if Iran becomes a nuclear power, does that then just mean they become even more powerful in the region and their ascent is increased rapidly? So that sort of brings us on to the actual nuclear capability of Iran and essentially what could Israel do as part of any strike. So just looking at Israel's military capability, I think there's two key sort of weapon systems that we need to talk about. And the first one's the F-35s that the Israelis have gotten from the Americans. So Israel first declared its F-35 fleet to be operationally capable in December of 2017. And that marked the completion of an intensive integration and training effort conducted at Nevatim Air Force Base in Israel. Now, the Israeli Air Force have given the F-35 the Hebrew name Adia, which means mighty one in Hebrew. Now, Nevatim Israeli Air Force Base is a base located near Beersheba, And Israel's fleet of F-35s are based at that airbase, and there's 2 squadrons. So you've got 140 squadron, you've got 116 squadron, and then there's 117 squadron, which actually conducts training on the aircraft. Now, back in 2015, interestingly, reports surfaced that the Israelis had been working on the F-35 prototypes and had managed to actually double the jet's flight and stealth capacity. And the extension would suggest that Israel could fly to Tehran and back without detection or without the need to refuel at US bases in the region. And then 3 years later, in July 2018, a Kuwaiti newspaper reported that Israel had flown a test mission of at least 3 F-35 jets to Tehran and back from an airbase in Tel Aviv. And I thought that was really interesting. Back, I'd say a decade ago, there were talks about the potential for Israel to actually target Iranian sites. And back then they were talking about using F-15s and F-16s. There was a requirement for them to be refueled in midair. Fast forward to today, and what you've got is the F-35s, and just the standard out-of-the-box F-35s would not have the range. They would have to be refueled. But this is really interesting in terms of what they're saying is that because of the modifications that Israel has made to the F-35s, they can basically fly to Iran and back. And as long as the stealth isn't compromised by the changes that they've made, of which Israel is a very technologically advanced country, and they can make these advances, it would be. This is, I guess, one of the most key points about all of this is that they can essentially target Iran without being detected.
I think it's a good case as well of Israel's foreign policy and its tactical, I guess, equipment procurement being a two-way street. So Israel is very aware that it's basically developing their F-35s with these bigger fuel tanks. It's quite a clear statement of what they're trying to achieve here, isn't it? There's no doubt in why they're doing this. And at the same time, the Israeli government's been very focused on developing this. It's the tactical ability for them to carry out a strike is significant for them, and this is something that they've been focusing on for years now, as you said.
And I guess the other military option for Israel is their Jericho missile. So Israel has a general designation which is given loosely to a family of deployed ballistic missiles which are called Jericho, and these have been developed from the 1960s forward. So Jericho 2 has a range of about 1,500 kilometers. Jericho 3, which is linked to the civilian space satellite launch vehicle program, so that's the Shavit. Now that one reportedly has a range of 4,800 kilometers. However, in a 2004 missile proliferation survey by the Congressional Research Service, this put its possible maximum range at 11,500 kilometers, which is just enormous. It essentially covers half of the globe. So really, Israel, from a ballistic missile perspective, they can strike Iran if they want.
Yeah, I'd say with ballistic missiles, they're less accurate. And with a lot of these sites being underground as well, I would question their ability to sort of penetrate the underground bunkers. And I know there's people talk about sort of tandem bombings, I guess, when you use one device to almost create a first hole and a second device lands exactly where the first one did. But this is going to be much more difficult with a ballistic missile, which just relies on gravity to fall down, which are less accurate as well. But then, with that said, I would say if Israel, it depends what Israel wants, I guess, from the strike. I think if Israel wants to effectively completely prevent Iran's program, it needs to be a broad strike that would actually stop the nuclear program. However, if they just want to send a message, if they just want to prove a point and maybe just cause destruction along the way, I do think ballistic missiles are probably an easier option. Because you can fire more of them. If they get intercepted, that's fine. You've got 10 more right behind it, or however many you want. And also, it's politically less damaging if one gets shot down, isn't it?
Yeah. So, just moving on then. So, from an actual attack perspective, there's clearly a few options that Israel could conduct. So, either they could use cruise missiles, they could use the F-35s, they could use a combination of them both. If they are actually using aircraft, now it depends on whether or not the F-35s can be detected by Iranian radar or not. If there is a potential, then Israel could use cyber, electronic and air attacks before launching a strike on nuclear facilities to essentially clear that path for them to actually go forward. Alternatively, Israel, as we said, could use their long-range Jericho surface-to-surface missiles, and by using these missiles, Israel can essentially avoid launching any aircraft on dangerous missions over Iran, which will bring us to a question of just how effective is Iran's air defense capability. But the point being with the Jericho missiles is that they carry less payload than an aircraft, and they're less accurate. With ballistic missiles, it's essentially they're fired up into the atmosphere, and then they use gravity to come down on the location, which makes them less accurate than a cruise missile, for example, that just cruises across the surface. And with certain munitions that Israel could use, some of these are sort of laser guided. So historically you've seen special forces deployed in places like Iraq or Libya to actually help precision airstrikes be more accurate. I'm not sure whether or not Israel would have that ability, just purely because of the distance and just how such a hostile environment it would be to their special forces. And we've sort of mentioned historically what an Israeli attack would look like. So, back in 2010, there was an article in the BBC, and they were talking about how the Israeli Air Force had purchased 125 advanced F-15 and F-16 warplanes, which were equipped with Israeli avionics and additional fuel tanks, and they were talking about 3 different routes. So one was a route that would take the Israeli aircraft across Turkey and into Iran from the north, and then route 2 would actually come through the center and through Jordan and then through Iraq. And then route 3 would go through Saudi. Now, I guess there was an implication historically with that, because it would almost appear as if Saudi, for example, allowed Israel to use their airspace, would that actually cause blowback on the Saudis? And I guess that's, what's your kind of thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's hard to talk about an Israeli strike on Iran without talking about the situation, the broader situation, I guess. And first things first, actually, I think before talking about Saudi, it's important to sort of speculate as to whether the US is on board with a strike or whether it's not. So I think if the US is on board with a strike, I think Israel would have more options, and US can pressure countries such as Saudi to perhaps allow them to use their airspace and just pretend that they didn't know they were there or something along those lines. Whereas if the US is against it, I think Israel would really struggle to carry something like this out, especially with the Israeli budget being so heavily reliant on US funding as well. But yeah, so Saudi's already sort of at threat, I guess, from the Houthi rebels in particular, with almost daily ballistic missile and drone strikes, and also with their proximity to Iran. There's any sort of blowback against Saudi would be quite hard for them to defend against. So the use of their airspace would be tricky. But again, if Saudi just they could deny it, and politically it would make Iran look like the aggressor if Iran were to retaliate against Saudi Arabia. But again, it's an option. And going through places such as Syria and Iraq, again, this is much more tricky because they're both hostile, and Syria has proven time and time again that Israeli aircraft can actually fly through Syrian airspace without being detected. So perhaps that's less of an issue than it could be. Iraq is a bit more of an unknown, with the Iraqi Air Force and being a bit more sophisticated. Also with US assets in Iraq itself, without US approval, this would be a very difficult route. So yeah, Israel's route to Iran, I think, completely depends on the situation in mind. And let's say this happens in the distant future, it's hard to tell what will have changed between then and now as well. Like, how will the relationship with Saudi Arabia and Israel solidified? Will it have worsened? Whatever it may be. So it's they have got options, but each option is dependent on prerequisites.
And coming back to the F-35s, because of the stealth component of them, they're kind of limited in terms of what weapon systems they can carry. So the Iranian nuclear facilities we've mentioned, they cover surface level installations of research facilities all the way through to bunkers, which are believed to hold ballistic missiles that could be used to actually carry any nuclear weapon. And the penetrator bombs that would be required to actually conduct these attacks against these bunker locations would likely be the GBU-28s. Now, just recently, the Italians, using their F-35As, in January of this year, they carried out the first tests of using GBU-12s. So based on the likely stealth profile of the Israeli aircrafts, it doesn't seem likely that they'd be able to carry these larger sort of bunker buster type bombs. So it seems they're likely going to have to, if there's any attack that's conducted, they're going to have to take out these surface level installations and perhaps use just general munitions to try to destroy the entrances to some of the bunkers of the underground facilities that Iran has. So just on that, and kind of moving on to the Iranian military capabilities, we've talked about the offensive capability from Israel in terms of F-35s and the ballistic missiles that they have. What is their response from Iran? What's the Iranian air defense capability like?
So Iran has always seen its air force as quite weak, it's quite antiquated, so it's always been more reliant on the defensive side of it. So rather than sort of interdicting any potential Israeli air attack, they've been more focused on simply defending against it, putting themselves on the back foot, but being prepared for that as well. So the Iranian air defense typically has always been quite dated. It's been a lot of it is to this day actually still relying on US military equipment shipped up before the revolution. So with much of this equipment, a lot of it has been updated since then, but the updates have been pretty limited. And with technology changing so fast, you can't help but wonder, is this technology even relevant anymore? Is it even effective, especially against aircraft like the F-35, which we've seen time and time again avoiding detection in Syria and other places as well. But then the more advanced side of the Iranian anti-aircraft arsenal is the S-300 missile system. And I think there's a lot to be said for this S-300. I think, definitely discussion in itself is actually how effective is the S-300 system. And whilst I was doing a bit of research for this, I was reading about them in sort of combat environments, and they are deployed in Syria under much news coverage. But then we were talking about this earlier, we're not 100% sure whether the S-300s in Syria are even in use during Israeli airstrikes. So we've seen a lot of unconfirmed and a lot of anecdotal reports from Syrian military personnel and news sources as well, claiming that the S-300s in Syria are still completely under control of the Russians, and the Russians, who are unwilling to be involved in the shoot-down of an Israeli aircraft, apparently don't let these S-300s even be used during strikes anyway, meaning air defense in Syria is relying on smaller systems such as the Pantsir and other more dated systems. So with that in mind, I think using Syria as an example to sort of judge the effectiveness of the S-300 is a bit tricky. But again, more recently as well is the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and there was S-300s deployed here as well. And these S-300s, however, were taken out by loitering munitions. Coincidentally, these loitering munitions were designed by an Israeli company as well. They were Harop drones. So 6 of them, I think, were destroyed by Azerbaijani forces during that conflict. And again, these air defense systems being destroyed by loitering munitions, so basically aircraft, I think brings up the question is how good is the radar coverage that comes with these? How good is their radar detection? And we've seen them make mistakes as well, shooting down a Russian reconnaissance plane once instead of an Israeli aircraft during strikes in Syria. So again, it's hard to gauge exactly how effective these S-300s are. It feels like the Iranian air defense systems are pinned on these S-300s as well. And they've got their own domestically produced version of them as well. But again, you can't help but question exactly how reliable they're going to be in the case of stealth aircraft.
I read an article in 2020 where a Syrian military person criticized the S-300 system and was saying that it was largely ineffective against Israeli airstrikes. And it was because of the radar system. So just kind of coming back to that from an air defense perspective, I think there's 2 really key incidents which kind of sum up the capability of Iran's air defense. So back in January 2020, you had a Boeing 737-800 that was shot down shortly after takeoff from Tehran Imam Khomeini International Airport by the IRGC. And in that incident, 176 passengers and crew were killed. And that occurred just 5 days after the US government authorized a drone strike against Qasem Soleimani. So clearly the Iranian air defense teams were on high alert, but they were unable to recognize just a standard plane that was taking off from Iran's airport, which raises questions in relation to the capability of their air defense. Conversely to that, in June of 2019, you had Iran's integrated system of air defense shot down a US RQ-4A Global Hawk surveillance drone with a surface-to-air missile over the Strait of Hormuz. Now, Iranian officials said that the drone was violating their airspace, while US officials responded and said that the drone was actually in international airspace. Now, in particular in that incident, it was the Cordad 3 AD system that was used, which can carry 3 Tyr 2B missiles, which have a range of 50 to 105 kilometers and can operate at altitudes of 25 to 30 kilometers. Now, the Global Hawk itself, that needs 3 people to remotely pilot it with sensors. It has a wider wingspan than a Boeing 737, a Rolls-Royce engine which moves it along at around 500 miles per hour, and it hoovers up signals and images normally at about 65,000 feet to keep it out of the way of surface-to-air missiles. And even if they get too close, it has a radar warning receiver, a jamming system, which then releases a decoy which is towed behind it. So that incident then actually showed effective capability of the Iranian air defense against US air assets. So I think, you kind of have two instances there, one which shows Iranian air defense to be poor and one which shows Iranian air defense to be capable, which I think probably sums up well the quality of Iran's air defense, but also raises the question of does a nation dare risk Iran being capable rather than being incapable, and will Israel make that calculated judgment that our F-35s can defeat any air defense that's within Iran, and it is an absolute must that we destroy their nuclear weapons capability, or at least put it back by a decade or maybe more.
Yeah, I think the payoff for an actual physical airstrike as well with the aid systems in place it suddenly starts to depreciate as you start thinking about all it would take is one Israeli jet to be shot down, pilot to be captured, and then put on state TV, and suddenly the political situation changes a lot. And without 100%, as you said, without 100% stopping the nuclear program, any strike which involves the shooting down of an Israeli plane would almost be seen as not worth it as a result. So yeah, I think with so many unknowns over the S-300 and Iranian air defense in general, from an Israeli perspective, you can't help but wonder, is it worth the risk? And it's going to be a huge risk until they have more information on exactly how effective the Iranian AA systems are.
And I guess that's the point in terms of we're looking at this from an open source perspective rather than a closed source perspective. We have no idea whether or not historically Israel have actually did conduct that operation where they sent 3 F-35s to Tehran and back, and they were not detected by any radar systems at all. So for us, a lot of this is speculation in relation to what we think is accurate.
And we also don't know how many missiles were fired at the US drone either, whether it was just one missile with 100% accuracy or whether it was a series of missiles with multiple misses before the final hit.
So just looking at the actual proximity of the S-300s and where they are, we've looked at a variety of different open sources. And what you essentially have, so we've created an IPB in relation to this webinar, which we're going to make available to our Discord server users, is you've got this centralized corridor of air defense which runs from the Strait of Hormuz all the way up to Tehran, and is a variety of S-75s, S-200s, S-300s, and then you've likely got a variety of all the rest of the air defense and anti-air artillery systems that they've got, which is protecting their airspace. And the coverage of these air defense systems essentially completely cover all of their nuclear sites, which is clearly exactly the reason why they're in place as part of that.
Just looking at the map there actually as well, there's no prizes for guessing what direction they think any threat is going to come from. It's quite clearly closely related to their foreign policy and the ongoing tensions with Israel too.
Yeah, exactly. Now, just moving on. So let's say, for example, that an Israeli airstrike is conducted, or they use ballistic missiles in relation to Iranian nuclear sites. What's our thoughts on what any reaction would be from Iran in relation to that attack?
Yeah, I think this goes back to what we were saying earlier with Iran's options and Iran biding its time a bit as well, because I think it depends at what point in the process Iran is and exactly how damaged I think any nuclear program would be after potential Israeli strikes. So there's a lot of ifs and a lot of question marks. But yes, I think the easiest way to answer it is looking at Iran's options again. So I think Iran does have the possibility to respond with a direct military response against Israel, but then whether or not this would be fully effective, it's hard to gauge. What capacity does Iran have to strike Israel from Iran itself with conventional military? I personally think this is probably their weakest option. I think Iran's limited when it comes to conventional military strength, but instead I think their strength and a more likely reaction from Iran would be via their proxies that we spoke about earlier. So whether this be mass rocket attacks from Gaza, which we've seen them carry out in the past against Israeli towns, or even or from others, even from Lebanon as well, depending on the situation in Lebanon, and from Syria, again, depending on the situation in Syria. This is likely, and also would have almost guaranteed to have an impact. And even if it doesn't necessarily cause any military damage or any casualties, every rocket attack that takes place in Israel from Gaza, these mass rocket strikes that we see, have quite a significant political impact on the Israeli leadership, and can also have quite a destabilizing impact on Israeli politics too, as people demand protection from these attacks, and it starts to tear Israeli political groupings apart, as one side perhaps wants a military response in Gaza and the other wants to stay away from that. So this is a good option, I think, for Iran. This is probably their strongest option they have as well. And then there's also the potential for state-backed terrorism and targeting Israel again. And we've seen in the past groups such as Hamas and Hezbollah carrying out terror attacks in Israeli targets. And whilst this has largely subsided recently in terms of sort of suicide bombings against civilian targets, there's no guarantee that this can't then be resurrected. This state-backed terror program can't be resurrected. So Iran's options, I would say, are less along the conventional military route and more down the proxy military route.
Of which Qasem Soleimani reportedly said 3 months before his death that he had organised 6 armies outside of Iranian control. And these armies included Lebanese Hezbollah, Hamas and regime forces in Syria, the Iraqi PMFs, Houthi militias in Yemen. And all of these forces represented a deterrent force for Iran. And yes, in recent history, they've been used as militias, essentially, and the PMF certainly in Iraq were a key part of defeating Islamic State. But historically, Hezbollah have been used as a terrorist organization, striking US targets in Lebanon as well as in Saudi Arabia and causing significant casualties. So I completely agree. I think if you're absolutely right, it depends on the scale as to what the airstrike looks like, and if it's a significant scale airstrike against nuclear sites, I think the immediate response would be terrorism incidents, striking of Israeli assets using indirect fire from the thousands of rockets that they have in the region that they can train onto Israel, but then also conducting terrorist attacks, not just on Israel, but potentially any nations who've actually supported Israel as part of this offensive.
I think sort of almost conversely to that as well, it's always sort of worth bringing up if we're going to talk about it. It's worth bringing up that these groups also have an element of agency to themselves as well. So whilst you're saying, actually, it just sort of came across my mind that these groups may be reluctant to carry out mass attacks immediately after a potential Israeli strike in Iran, because they also, despite being proxies of Iran, they do have their own considerations to take into account too. So, for example, groups in the Gaza Strip, whilst in the past have shown that they are very willing to carry out mass rocket attacks against Israel, may be in a situation at the time of attack when they are perhaps less willing to attack Israel, because there's a complex relationship between these groups in Gaza and Israel in terms of whenever there's attacks, Israel tends to restrict the movement of Palestinians from Gaza and in the West Bank. So these Gazan groups may be under their own pressure, they may be in their own difficult situations, which may perhaps weaken Iran's response via proxy.
And I guess one thing we have to talk about is the Strait of Hormuz and just what impact Iran could leverage on that area. So, back in 1971, when Britain was withdrawing its forces from the Gulf, Iran then seized some of the islands within the Strait of Hormuz, and they now control all of the islands in that area. So they essentially control the gateway to the mass oil producing region of the world. And historically, back in 2011, Iranian Vice President Mohammad Reza Rahimi, he threatened to close the strait if Western sanctions on Iran affected its oil exports. And then, more recently, there's been articles in Forbes from April 2020, which was discussing some of the weapon systems that have been placed within some of the islands within the Strait of Hormuz. So you've got weapon systems like the Fajr 5, which can hit targets from 45 miles away, the Fajr 3, which is based on North Korean design, and this rocket appears to be Iranian in origin, but that one reportedly has a range of up to 80 miles. So there's a variety of weapon systems that are in place in the Strait of Hormuz, as well as they have the ability to quickly mine the Strait of Hormuz. So they could, if they wanted to, as their sort of weapon of mass destruction prior to getting a nuclear weapon, or if they can't get a nuclear weapon, just mine the Strait of Hormuz and prevent any oil from getting out of that region, which would, one, have a massive impact on East Asian economies, which are massively reliant on oil from that region, but it will also have a massive impact on oil-producing nations within that region, including Saudi Arabia and other enemies of Iran, and that then would have a significant impact on the globe, which is also already having massive issues economically. This would just be the sort of death knell for the global economy if they were to carry out this any sort of mining of the strait or impacting the ability to get oil out of that region.
I think Iran would be perhaps reluctant to, with the current situation in mind, I think Iran would be reluctant to do something, because that would be a very major move. It would be huge, and it would also alienate them from a lot of the world community as well. So I think Iran would be reluctant because it would almost invite conventional military response, which, as we were saying earlier, Iran doesn't feel confident, I don't think, in its conventional military. It doesn't feel like it has the military, the navy, or the air force to stand up against sides such as Israel and the USA. So I think whilst that's ironically almost like a nuclear option, it would have a significant impact. Even just, as you said, mining, that would increase the cost of shipping. Even if it doesn't fully stop shipping, the cost of shipping would increase drastically as a result of higher insurance. and as also yes, anti-ship cruise missiles as well, which can reach across the straits. But again, even if they don't block the straits, the mere threat of blocking the straits, or they're just increasing the danger of going through the straits is more than enough. But it would, as we said, I think invite a conventional military response, which if I was Iran, I'd be trying to avoid with their current state of their military.
Yeah, and if the US were not part of this offensive against the nuclear sites, it could draw them in. And that's why the US has so many military assets within the region, is to keep that corridor open.
Yes, yeah.
So one other point that was brought up actually via one of our users on the Discord server was in relation to Iran's cyber espionage capabilities. So this was an article where an Israeli cybersecurity company detailed how Iranian actors are actually running an operation to steal information from targets around Israel. And Iranian threat actors are running a highly targeted cyber espionage operation against global aerospace and telecommunications companies, and they're stealing sensitive information from targets around Israel and the Middle East. So I guess that could be another one of their cyber offensive capabilities. And I think we've seen reports in recent history of the targeting of key infrastructure sites within Israel in an attempt to target those. And I guess for Iran, that would be another one of their most likely response options would be a cyber attack against Israel. Yeah,
and they've clearly got the capacity to do it. I think it was the water infrastructure that was targeted, and also the blowback, as they call it, from such an incident would be very minimal. It's unlikely that they would. It's hard to also pin Iran down as the actor in question if a cyber attack is carried out as well. So it's I guess a cheap option for Iran.
So just moving on to the actual global impact, and again we've said a lot of this is predicated on just how significant is the offensive operation that is potentially carried out by Israel in relation to Iran's nuclear locations. So if it got to a point where there was the potential for them to actually block the strait, back in March 2009, as an example, 2 US Navy vessels accidentally collided in the strait, and while neither sank and neither even briefly blocked the strait, the incident resulted in a sudden rise in the price of oil and was highlighting how susceptible markets are to any potential closure of Hormuz at that time. So even just an incident like that where the strait wasn't blocked, it caused the price of oil to increase. Surely if the strait is actually blocked, it's just going to significantly impact the price of oil. And it's going to affect not just the civilian population, but also industry, militaries, their ability to actually operate because of the impact on that price. What other global impacts do you think we'd see as a result of any targeting of Iran's nuclear infrastructure?
I think from a geopolitics point of view as well, I think it would force a lot of states to pick a side. I can't, it would be a difficult situation for Middle Eastern states to stay neutral in, and any fallout or any sort of retaliation would likely draw in more states. So I think it could go either way. It could go similar to what the Qasem Soleimani assassination brought about, which was a limited response, or it could be considered by Iran as an all-out military conflict in which sort of gloves are off. I think if that were the case, I can't see this conflict remaining localized. I think it would very easily spread and draw in more and more actors. And it's with Israel being involved, the USA would almost certainly become involved, especially if the attacks themselves had US sanction, US sort of cooperation with Israel as well. So it's I think the geopolitical impact would be quite obvious. It's hard to see this not being like a major political incident, but it would also, I think, polarize the region further, destabilize the region further. As you said, the relationship on this with shipping and oil products and oil price and related industry is quite obvious, negative for sure.
And we'd likely see global demonstrations in relation to Israel's actions. We already see it now with BDS movements and Palestine solidarity movements protesting against Israel. And I'd imagine this would just ratchet up tensions and you'd see an increase in protests against an offensive Israeli action. But you'd also likely see an increase in anti-Semitic attacks against people who are obviously Jewish as part of this. So I can see an increase in tensions globally as a result of this. But you also see likely protests in places like Pakistan and a variety of other countries in relation to Israeli action.
I think with that in mind as well, the payoff sort of for carrying out strikes just suddenly starts to get smaller and smaller, doesn't it? It starts to become less of an appealing option.
So moving on to our assessment, which is the final part of this webinar. So what do we think? Do we think an Israeli airstrike or Israeli offensive action is likely against Iran in the short term? What's your thoughts?
I think in the short term it's unlikely. I think with Biden administration coming in and their willingness to engage in nuclear talks, and Iran showing willingness to engage in nuclear talks, as well as the Israeli government showing willingness to engage in nuclear talks, I think all sides are willing to give these talks, at least just give them a go before becoming more hawkish again. And I think the political situation right now just isn't in Israel's favour to carry out a strike. I can't see the Biden administration, without a significant change in events or without a significant incident forcing his hand, I can't see the Biden administration allowing Israel to carry out strikes targeting Iran, especially with as we just mentioned, the political fallout that will come from it. I think with that in mind, like, Israel obviously is going to remain concerned. Israel's wary that Iran is close to getting the nuclear warhead, so even just a short period, just one US administration, 1 4-year period of the talks breaking down and Iran progressing with its program would be enough to get them very close enough to significantly worry Israel. So I think it's, but with all this in mind, I do think it's unlikely. I think the fallout, the payoff is too low. I think I just can't see Israel being able to mount an operation which would guarantee to stop the nuclear program. At the same time, not losing any of their own aircraft or not having some form of disaster. And then you've got military friction in such an operation as well. Something will go wrong. Something always goes wrong in military operations. It's hard to see how something this massive would go without any issues. So one mistake and the whole game's up for them. I just can't see them weighing that as the best option in the short term.
And I think for me, it comes back to two recent statements in September at the UN. So you had Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who said that Iran has enriched uranium to the level of 60%, which is one step short of weapons-grade material, and they're getting away with it, and saying that Iran will not allow Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon. But then you also had, at the UN General Assembly, Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdollahian, and he stated that for Iran to actually return to the nuclear deal, Biden would have to provide more sanctions relief than the Obama administration did. So I was reading an article from the Wall Street Journal, and they were basically saying that Trump had this maximum pressure campaign, whereas President Biden would have, call it a maximum carrots diplomacy. So he'll probably just try and offer more and more carrots to get Iran back to the table, which I thought was interesting. But I completely agree. I think any conflict between the two of them at this time is likely to be very destructive for both nations, especially as they're both kind of trying to recover from the COVID and the impact that it's had. But I think from Israel's perspective, they will wait until the very final moment as to just about the time when Iran is getting the potential to have a nuclear weapon that can then be put onto a ballistic missile and weaponized. That's the point if ever they were going to actually conduct an offensive campaign against Iran, they would do that. Unless somehow Iran suddenly got an air defense system that could block the F-35s. That would be the other aspect that would force their hand in order to actually conduct this airstrike. Thanks very much, Max, for your insight today. So to summarize what we've spoken about, we spoke about the issue in relation to why there are these tensions between Israel and Iran over Iran's nuclear program. We talked about how this is actually playing out currently in terms of this proxy conflict, but also the airstrikes that are being conducted by Israel against Iranian proxy forces. The Israeli military capabilities that they have, so the F-35, the Jericho missiles, which have the range to actually strike at Iran, but also what an Israeli attack would look like, and then the Iranian military capabilities as well, which are various and significant. And then finally, what would Iran's response be, and the likely global impact. Don't forget, we'll be continuing the conversation over in our Discord intelligence community. Join now by using the link in the description, and we'll see you there.